Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another installment in a reviewed and ranked series. Today, we will be starting into the characters added in the third and final installment of the DLC for this game. And yeah, there hasn't been any new content provided in over a year from the developers themselves. So this is kind of the home stretch for the reviewed and ranked series. Specifically, we'll be starting with the head of the Fantastic Four team, Mr. Fantastic himself. And he's very quirky and a very interesting character with incredibly unique animations. So let's dive in and talk a little bit more about how this character functions. But before we do, make sure to check and see if you are subscribed to the channel. If you're not, go ahead and fix that for me real quick, as there is that daily variety content coming your way. And if you find today's video helpful, enjoyable, and or interesting, make sure that you hit that like button. So we're going to start where we always do, with the team build synergies. And Mr. Fantastic has 4 synergies, and they are spread across 3 different categories. He has 2 defense synergies with Family Values and Fantastic Four, 1 resilience synergy with Big Brains, and 1 energy synergy with Team Leaders. Mr. Fantastic has a lot of defensive team build attributes to him, which in my opinion isn't very strong, because most of your team is supposed to be oriented around giving yourself some additional power, whether that's in the form of more strength or more energy to use those attacks, or mastery to make those attacks more efficient. And he only has 1 synergy that fits into that category, so not really something super impressive, and not someone that you would want to put on your team for a synergy type boost. But there are maybe other reasons that you would look to include him that we'll talk about in just a moment. Moving on to talk about the basic functions of Mr. Fantastic. His basic attack sequence has 5 different hits, and he has the longest trajectory on his basic attack sequence. He has 2 elongated punches, 2 elongated fist slams down into the ground, and then that 5th strike, he will stretch both of his arms out, grab onto the ground, and then whip himself forward for an elastic-powered kick move. So he covers a lot of ground with this sequence, and it makes sense as to why he would cover that much ground with these attacks, because he is very elastic and has more reach than other characters in the cast. But at the same time, that's kind of a detriment to him, because even though he can reach further, he's going to send himself very far away from the engagement that he is involved in. And then you've got to turn around and backtrack towards those opponents, assuming that you didn't take them down with that basic attack sequence. Sure, it's kind of nice that you have an automatic escape tool when using your basic attack sequence, but it's not great, because it sends you away from those engagements before they've closed and causes you to retreat and backtrack to repeat that same cycle. So it's really awesome how these things are animated, but there's considerable drawbacks to the combat method that he employs. Mr. Fantastic's heavy attack is also very unique to him, but has its fair share of drawbacks as well. Mr. Fantastic will whip his arms around him in a 360-degree motion, but as a result of that, he gets tangled up in his own arms, and there is a mandatory animation that requires him to unwind and untangle himself before he becomes actionable again. Probably one of the weakest heavy attacks in the game. It has a considerable amount of range to it, and in that 360 degrees around the character, but the fact that he's rendered vulnerable for over a full second after the hitbox has tapered off of that attack doesn't really speak well to the implications of this particular attack, and I would avoid using it in basically every single scenario. Maybe a decent option as a combat ender for finishing off a round of opponents that are in your immediate vicinity, or to keep you from rocketing away at the end of your basic attack sequence. But apart from that, nothing super impressive going on here, and a lot more drawbacks than the traditional heavy attacks that we've looked at. Mr. Fantastic has a glide mechanic, and we talked a little bit about gliding with Moon Knight, and Moon Knight's glide compared to Mr. Fantastic is by far the better of the two. Mr. Fantastic doesn't glide very far, and it doesn't look very great. Like, he stretches his body out to be basically a large carpet type mat, and then just kind of slowly flops down onto the ground. And I don't like the noise that it makes. It sounds like he's been punched in the throat when he flaps open like that. It's just all around not a really good option. It doesn't allow you to traverse any more effectively. Sure, it slows your descent a little bit, but again, Moon Knight can actually glide a considerable distance with his glide mechanic, and Mr. Fantastic can't really. So there's not a whole lot of practicality to using this, and you'll probably never make efficient use of Mr. Fantastic's traversal as opposed to Moon Knight's, but either way, teleportation is the better ability that you can use when airborne if you have a character that can do so and you're trying to go farther and close the distance as you are traversing said areas. Mr. Fantastic's falling aerial isn't bad. It's actually probably one of the better ones that we've seen out of a fair selection of the DLC characters thus far. He basically turns himself into a large rubber sphere and drops right down on top of the opponents that are immediately underneath him, having a 360-degree shockwave right around the point of impact there, with of course the focal point being immediately where he makes contact with the ground. So a fair amount of damage can be dealt using this falling aerial, but the drawback with this one, as with most falling aerials in the cast, he does not have an ability that sets him up into using a falling aerial naturally, so you need to make a conscious and deliberate decision to use this ability if you are going to attack from the air with Mr. Fantastic, because he's not an aerial-based character, so there's no reason for him to use it at all. And then we have Mr. Fantastic's block and dodge animation, which he starts with elongating his arms in a cross out in front of him to block a bunch of the incoming blows coming from his opponents, and then he does perform a combat roll out of the way. But because he's so elastic, it's a very unique animation to him, because he stretches out and does a very large, exaggerated somersault, and it's just kind of hilarious and hysterical to watch. It's very fitting to his character and is probably the best animated item in his standard kit, but it serves its purpose for getting him out of harm's way when and if there is incoming attacks from his opponents that you are actively seeking to get away from. Let's pivot over and talk a little bit about Mr. Fantastic's abilities. To start off with, we have the elongated attack, and this is a very powerful move in Mr. Fantastic's kit. Basically, he will stretch out and raise himself up into the air and then continuously rain punches down on his opponents in a very wide sphere of influence. And because of the sheer amount of damage that this ability can unleash, I am going to go ahead and give this the DLC privilege move for Mr. Fantastic. There's really only one other move that was anywhere in the competition for that, but we'll talk about why that move did not get the award when we talk about that ability in a little more detail. But the elongated attack is a very rapid impact, high damage dealing ability within his kit, and can be matched continuously, and you can mow down large groups of opponents by using this ability in this way. And upon finishing mashing on that button to continue attacking, there is one larger hitbox that takes place at the very end that will send any opponents that were not knocked out by the use of this ability flying away from him. So a lot of things to love about the elongated attack. This has the melee attack type and the barrage synergy trait, and bolsters an A classification to the damage dealt, being a lot better at dealing with the grunt type characters than most other moves in his kit. It also has a C classification to the energy points consumed and a D classification to the stagger damage dealt. It'll still do fine in dealing damage to the stagger bars of the opponents, mainly based off of the sheer amount of strikes that come out of this attack while it is being used. There are other things that you can do a lot better with when it comes to dealing damage to those staggered gauges. As all of Mr. Fantastic's abilities are ranked up, they do benefit from a reduced energy point cost, an increase to the attack damage dealt, an increase to the stagger damage dealt, and finally the reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. Mr. Fantastic's second ability is the extended radius, and we've seen a similar attack in function from Miss Marvel in this game, but Mr. Fantastic's version of this attack works a little bit better because it has 2 hitboxes as opposed to just 1. Basically, Mr. Fantastic will extend his arms out and away from his body, and you can continuously use this ability again by mashing the button. He will spin around like a top, and he does walk forward while using this ability, but by influencing the left joystick, you can control the trajectory that he takes as he moves throughout the battlefield. It's not his greatest damage dealer, but it's a pretty good blanket statement for attacking into opponents, and it has a wide double hitbox on both arms as he's spinning around, so you do tend to get a little bit more damage out of this ability as you would the ability from Miss Marvel. The extended radius has the melee attack type and the area assault synergy trait, and boasts Cs across the board for both damage, stagger damage, as well as the energy points consumed. And all around a fair option, but nothing super impressive compared to a lot of the rest of the cast. Mr. Fantastic's third ability is the full momentum, which I really like the concept of how this attack works, but in actually applying the attack, it doesn't work as well as you would hope that it would. It's basically an inferior version of the Hulk's unstoppable charge, and there's definite reasons behind that. So Mr. Fantastic will bend himself into a ring and perform a spinning attack, which he basically rolls himself around at a decent velocity around the battlefield. And again, you can continue to use this ability by mashing the attack button, and you can control the direction in which Mr. Fantastic goes again by using the left joystick. But the biggest problem with this attack is, as opposed to the unstoppable charge by the Incredible Hulk, when and if he comes into contact with an opponent that doesn't get knocked out of the way, he will bounce back off of them, and that really detracts from the damage that this ability could be doing. And it just could be so much better than what it is, and it's not, and it's just kind of sad. And that's the sad but true nature of the full momentum ability. It does have the melee attack type and the charge synergy trait, and has decent stats with both B classifications to the damage dealt and the stagger damage dealt, while maintaining the C classification to energy points consumed. But the fact of the matter is you're going to be either rolling away from your opponents, or you're going to be bumped back away from the mini-boss characters and mighty enemies to the point where you would be better off using other options for getting in that damage. You can continue to ram into them, assuming that they don't move away from you, but it's not great in terms of how this move is executed. Mr. Fantastic's fourth and final ability is the Stretching Slam, and this was the other ability that was in the running for having the DLC privilege awarded to it, and by a first glance at the stats, you're probably wondering why I didn't grant it that. I mean, it has an A classification to both damage and stagger damage dealt, where the elongated attack had a D classification to that stagger damage stat. But the biggest problem that I have with this ability is that it is exactly the same as the Hulk's Gamma Slam, with the exception of it not being able to be synergized. There is no reason that this ability cannot be used in a synergy trait. You just apply the Slam synergy trait to it, and there you go. But for whatever reason, it was decided that this ability was not allowed to have a synergy trait or allowed to be synergized, and that detracts a lot from it, because you have to then make a conscious decision to use this ability as opposed to picking a synergy that's available based off of your adjacent teammates, and that really subtracts away from what this attack could be. It's still fairly powerful, because if Mr. Fantastic makes contact with an opponent, particularly a grunt type opponent that's humanoid, it doesn't work against the insectoids included in his DLC expansion, but if he grabs a humanoid opponent He will, but if this attack makes contact with a humanoid opponent, it will grab onto them, swing them around, and then slam them down into the ground, which deals excessive amounts of damage not only to the grab target, but any opponents that are within that area of influence. And it has a wider swing radius than Hulk's Gamma Slam, and maybe that's the reason that they decided to not synergize it. I don't think that there's any reason that this ability couldn't have been, and he would be a substantially better character if even that small little change were made to this ability. The Stretching Slam has the melee attack type, has A classifications to the damage and stagger damage dealt, while maintaining a C classification to the energy points consumed. And again, the biggest thing holding this back is the fact that it cannot be synergized with other members of your team. Mr. Fantastic's Extreme Attack is, again, it's a very unique animation to him, and it gets the job done. It actually takes place in a fairly quick little time frame, being one of the faster extreme attacks that we've looked at thus far. So basically, he will create a zigzag pattern as he stretches his body to the full extent of his limits before retracting back up to a focal point up above his opponents and dropping down in a larger version of his falling aerial attack that crushes the opponents that are left down beneath him. And so it's actually a decent attack for hitting into boss opponents because it takes up a very large amount of space, it's executed fairly quickly, and does a considerable amount of damage to those opponents. And the biggest caution with this ability is the fact that you do need to be aware of where you detonate it, because he will start the ability right where he stands, and even though it does have a large sphere of influence around it, you do want to make sure that you're as close to the multiple targets or boss that you are targeting when using this extreme attack. So now that we've had a chance to look at how Mr. Fantastic behaves and how he functions as a character, we've got to determine where he belongs in our tier list. And it should be fairly obvious that I don't think that this character has what it takes to be in the top end of the list of characters. He just doesn't. And it's sad that that's the case, but he could have been so much better, especially for being such a quintessential character. And I don't feel like he was misrepresented per se, but there was a lot of things missing that could have been done a lot more efficiently. And even if he had the Stretching Slam upgraded to a Slam Synergy trait attack, that would have bolstered him a couple of rungs up on that tier list for sure. So where do I feel like he belongs? I don't think that he's in the bottom half of this list or anything C tier or lower, but he certainly still gets outclassed by a lot of the characters that are here in B tier. And I sat here and thought about it and looked back through the way that he works, and I think that the best placement for him is right here between Deadpool and Spider-Man. Just because there are other characters in this tier that still kind of outclass what Mr. Fantastic's capable of. You've got Storm and Loki with their elemental attribute type attacks. You have Nightcrawler that goes around and maneuvers the battlefield at insane speeds and is absolutely paramount for speedrunning this game, as nobody else really comes close. You have characters that hit much harder in the form of Iron Fist and Venom. But Mr. Fantastic, he's just missing a lot of those attributes that bolster these other characters to the higher end of this tier. And the more I sit and I think about it, the less I think that Mr. Fantastic belongs outside of this placement in this tier. But what do you think? Do you think that there's something that I missed about Mr. Fantastic's kit or didn't pay enough mind? Be sure to let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. Again, if you've made it this far into the video and you enjoyed, make sure that you leave a like, and we will see you in this installment next week as we talk about Invisible Woman, and I hope that you choose to view a couple of the videos that take place between now and then. Thanks again for your time, and I hope that you have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day.